Welcome back to Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality, more than just skin deep. I'm your host, Enzi, and this week, y'all, we're going to talk about teacher strikes. Alright, let's get it going. So, Minneapolis School District students missed 15 days of school this year after a teacher strike. In fact, it was the first teacher strike in over 50 years in Minneapolis. And it was 3 weeks, just about 15 missed days of striking to get the things that was needed for students, for teachers, and equitable pay. I'm not going to go into details because I looked into it and did research, but I don't know a lot about teacher strike, and I would rather have someone on at some point and talk about that as opposed to me rambling and trying to make some stuff up about the teacher strike. And recognizing that Minneapolis teachers represents a struggle that our nation constantly deals with, which is equitable pay for our teachers, small classes for students, mental health supports, some of the things that allows people to thrive in some of the best ways. And needing to be able to do whatever needs to happen to get that for our students, and for the students, it's extremely important. And this is not just in the education field, right? Like, we have seen an upheaval and a larger amount of folks that are becoming unionized. Social workers are becoming unionized. Nonprofit agencies are becoming more and more unionized. And I say that to say that there is, particularly now, and people are more aware of, there's a really need and a push to have equitable pay, but not just equitable pay, have a livable wage. That is important. So a few things about the teacher strike, just that it had me thinking. One is, I just want to shout out or say that there were multiple videos or pictures from the 1970s Minneapolis teacher strike archive with a young prince out protesting and supporting the teachers. I thought that was pretty awesome, and it was just a reminder that there are struggles that are continue to happen and continue to exist. But while we were going through the teacher strike in Minneapolis, my mind wandered to another teacher strike, the 1968/69 New York teacher strike. This is a strike that maybe not many people know about. It was not your typical strike in the sense that a union was striking for economic rights, was striking for material things. The strike, the way it came out, would be dependent upon who you asked, whether or not you asked the black community in the Ocean Hill, Brownsville area, or whether you ask you ask the Jewish community, the predominant Jewish teachers at the union at the time. The language, the rhetoric was that the teacher strike was striking to protect white teachers from black racists. I'm going to say that again. The 1968-1969 teacher strike was portrayed by the media as a strike for white teachers against black racists. Not many people stop and ask, what was happening? What was this threat? How did this happen? And I'm not going to give it the best credit it needs, because I want to bring someone on again, whether it's the same episode or a different one. I want to bring someone else on and talk a little bit more in detail about the 1968-1969 teacher strike, because it's important in many ways. And and it's important in particular if we look at relations in the non-black Jewish community as well as the non-Jewish black community. It points to a time, or it points to a reality of this, perhaps this myth of non-Jewish black folks and non-black Jewish folks always getting along in the 60s and during the civil rights movement. This teacher strike tells us of a different story. Tells us another story. It doesn't say that the first story isn't true, but what it tells us is that there was more going on. When I often think about that 1968-69 teacher strike, I understand it and often talk about it as a refusal to go to community-owned schools. And the complex piece of it is you have black parents and students wanting to educate their students, their community, and we get the teacher strike as a reaction to that desire. Teachers were not fired when they were were asked to be reassigned. They didn't lose their jobs. They were asked to be reassigned so that way community members would be assigned to the community school. And it is easy if we look at this through many lenses. But the first piece is, or the first question is, particularly if you're Jewish, how many of y'all have heard of the 1968-1969 New York teacher strike? Because it's a part of our history, right? The Ocean Hill-Brownsville community. How many of us knows about it? And if you do know about it, what do you know about it? What have you read? What have you heard? How have you encountered the story of what happened? The reality is when we think about that time as a community, particularly as a Jewish community, we want to point to Heschel and look at the things that Heschel did with King, and forgetting one, that many in the Jewish community did not care too much for Heschel during that time. But two, the thing about the Ocean Hill-Brownsville teacher strike and the time is, it starts 2 months after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. You have these students that have been in school since April 4th and navigating these tense racial moments in the history. This, from April 4th for several months at least, there were uprisings going on across the nation. 1968 was not really the safest place for black men, black folks in general, in the United States. And for some, the safety can or could have and have in other times been a place of safety for students. And when navigating racial tensions, I cannot imagine what these students navigated and had to deal with before the strike, but also navigating a major racial shift in the country, to watch on the news and hear about all the things that is going on after Martin Luther King Jr., the man who many looked up to, was assassinated. This is the backdrop. This is the context for me when I think of what happened then. It's New York. It's a very large Jewish community. I don't know the I assume, I used to always assume there was a pretty large black community, but that may or may not be true. And when I say large Jewish community, I don't mean in the sense of in comparison to the rest of the population. I mean it in comparison to the concentration of Jews in one area. Thinking about, I'm in Minneapolis. Compared to New York, there's not many of us here. And compared to other places, like, I don't know, Kansas City, there's a ton of us here in Minneapolis. And so it's about where how we see things. And it is also about the way we remember history, the way we tell it, the way we go back and look at newspapers. And if we can see in 2022 the ways in which newspapers are biased, the ways in which newspapers do not tell the truth all the time. Let me be clear. There is nothing wrong with newspapers. But you have to realize that we have to be mindful of the ways in which and the reality that we see things through this lens in which makes sense to us through our worldview, as well as understanding the context of the time. And so wondering and thinking about this is 1968, May of 1968. Again, like I've already said, 2 months after the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And there were uprisings across the nation. Cities across the United States of America burned. And that is the backdrop of the 1968-69 Ocean Hill-Brownsville teacher strike. That is not the only backdrop. There's much more happening and going on at that time. And it is an important piece of that puzzle. I look forward to having more people on to be able to talk a little bit about this and educate you all more about the New York teacher strike. If you have a topic that you're interested in, feel free to tweet at me or however you want to do it. Again, this is Enzi. Kumba Hineni, a podcast for intersectionality, more than just skin deep. Thanks again. Until next time. Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality, more than just skin deep, is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. You can email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast.